Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is lecture 8D of Real Statistics in Islamic Approach. This lecture deals with the statistics with GNP, which is undoubtedly one of the most important application of statistics to the real world. At the same time, it is a hopelessly bad measure of the prosperity of a nation and leads to extremely poor policy. And our goal in this lecture is to discuss why. Famous saying that there are lies, damned lies in statistics, meaning the statistics is the worst kind of a lie. So why is that true? Well, the world that we are living in is described by billions of numbers. Every human being is extremely important, and how he or she is living is extremely important, and there are numbers which we could use to describe their lives. If I take any particular subset of the billions of numbers that describe the world, I am automatically omitting the vast majority of information. And there is no way that we are able to process all this information, so we must summarize. And when we summarize, it requires judgment. We have to say, okay, these numbers are important, these millions of numbers don't make any difference, and these few, the 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or even a million numbers that I choose, these are the important numbers. I am making an assertion. So anytime I pick a number, I am choosing one number which may be a fact and which describes the world, but I'm at the same time ignoring millions of numbers. And so I'm making a judgment that this number is the important truth about the real world, and all the other things that I have neglected are unimportant truths. So in this sense, every single number that I quote, every statistic is actually a lie, because it highlights one aspect of the world and hides much more than it reveals. Statistics originated in terms of demographics and gathering other data for the purpose of governance, to drive policy. Now, policy that we make is driven by goals. What do we want to achieve? Now, these goals are not those of the public as a whole, but of the small power group that is actually making policy. So the conventional mode of analysis in statistics is that we take the numbers, we take the policies, we take the goals, everything is given, and our job is to just analyze the numbers. But this is what we want to differ with. In any Islamic approach, we cannot confine ourselves to the small part, but we need to look at what this number is going to be used for, what this analysis, what is the policy that is going to be made with this analysis. And we have to look at the goals of the analysis, and we have to ask, are these aligned with Islamic views or not? So we must learn to think outside the box created by the numbers. So when it comes to concepts like GDP, we need to ask, how did this originate? Who started this idea? So if you look at early 20th century, when England was the ruling power, they did not use the concept of GDP to define power. They had other definitions. A great nation has coal mines, sea power, and many other factors which were unique to England. So basically, it was a fact which was known qualitatively to everyone, that England is the ruler of the world. Then the question is to find numbers which justify this. So Britannia found criteria in which England would lead. After World War I and World War II destroyed the European economies, USA emerged as the leader of the world, and then they had to find numbers which explain this leadership. So GDP is a way to explain the dominant position of USA. You start with the intuition that you start with what you see qualitatively, that US is the world leader, and then you try to explain why. And especially you want to explain why in terms of numbers. So you can see that US is the most wealthy country in the world. Then you try to quantify wealth, and that GDP turns out to be useful quantification, and that is the criteria that emerged more or less as in the early 20th century as USA was gaining power. When OPEC countries acquired higher GDP per capita because of their oil exports, then the definition was modified to include income distributions. And then when some Scandinavian countries went ahead of USA in income per capita, then the definition was changed to include or add infrastructure. So this is not trickery or propaganda. It is just an attempt to understand, to analyze an intuition that we see that USA is the world leader, and now what are the numbers which we can use to prove this intuition. This leads to the key understanding that I would like to convey in this lecture, that we start with a qualitative idea, a concept, a big picture, and then we try to express it or boil it down to numbers. So, for example, I want to find out what is the quality of research. So I can say that, okay, he has published a lot of papers, he has written books, his ideas have influenced other people. And for all of these, we can find some numbers. How many articles has he published? And impact factor, which discusses how many people have cited your research. So these are all indicators, but this is not the real thing. And yet, this is what very often happens, that people confuse the numbers, the indicators, with the reality. And when you do that, when you say that the indicator is the reality, the number of papers published is the quality of research, then you are making a mistake, and actually that's why this number is actually a lie. The IQ number 123 doesn't really measure intelligence, and if you start thinking that this number is the intelligence, then that is a lie, that is a falsehood. It is useful to introduce the concept of the Pygmalion effect. Pygmalion was a sculptor in Greek mythology who fell in love with a statue that he had made himself from ivory. And so he made a prayer to the goddess of love, and this statue became a living woman. So just exactly like this, statistics, numbers are created to try to capture some intuition, some qualitative, some concept which lies behind, like intelligence being measured by the IQ test. But then the people who invent the test or the statistic or the ways to measure fall in love with their methodology and the numbers they generate, and they replace them, they replace the reality by the numbers, and that's when statistics becomes a lie. So this is a very common problem today. We say, okay, intelligence. Well, what's intelligence? We all know what intelligence is qualitatively. It measures a collection of skills for how we navigate the world around us. But we can say, okay, that's not something I can measure, so let me measure it by an IQ test. So we create a quiz and we ask people to take the quiz, and we take the number and we say, okay, this is your intelligence. Your intelligence is 125. And so now this number is an imperfect measure of what we are really trying to measure. But if we take that number as the reality and say, okay, this is the intelligence, then we have made a mistake. We have confused the indicator with the reality. Similarly, we want to assess how well a student will do in college, so we have this scholastic aptitude test. And then if we take the score on the test as the measure of somebody's ability, this is a mistake. This is happening throughout the world. People are trying to quantify performance. So for example, in a police department, they say, okay, how many challans do you issue every day? How many fines? So if you make that the performance indicator, then the police go out and start issuing fines for every thing or the other because they want to improve their performance in terms of the indicators. So these are there are many mistakes that happen in the university quality. If it's measured by rankings, then people try to maximize their score in the ranking, and the score in the ranking may have nothing to do with genuine quality of teaching. Just like all of these examples, so there is the concept of the wealth of nations, which is a multi-dimensional concept. Many different things go into making a nation wealthy, powerful, and prosperous. But we all boil it down to one number, and today this one number captures the minds of policymakers throughout the world, and everybody is trying to maximize the GDP and to maximize the growth rate of the GDP. And yet this leads to very bad policy because it neglects very many important dimensions of national prosperity. And so this lecture is devoted to understanding the ways in which the GDP is deficient. So the way to understand statistics is to understand that we are trying to take some concept and translate it into numbers. So the GDP is a way to measure the wealth and power of a nation. Or the question is this a good indicator of what we are trying to measure? Now the standard approach is to just look at the number. So even this idea that with this number what are we actually trying to measure is not clearly formulated. And yet if we want to understand the source, if we want to understand the reality, we have to get behind the scenes and we have to ask, with this number, what is it that you're trying to measure? GDP has become a catch-all, the one number which measures everything, and actually it represents an old problem which mankind faced, one of poverty and scarcity, where people didn't have enough to eat and drink, and still billions of people don't have enough to eat and don't have health care and don't have education and don't have basic needs. So we say that, okay, give people more and more consumption, and basically the solution to the problems of life is to have more and more goods and services. And this is true for poor people, but it is not true for rich people. If some person already has the basic needs, then giving him more does not help him. In fact, it hinders and distracts him from the real goals of life. So the amount of consumption and the amount of things being sold in the marketplace is an imperfect measure of something that is desirable to a certain extent. And it can be a useful measure if it is taken properly as one imperfect indicator of something that is desirable. But if you take it as the overall, if you make it living, if you fall into the Pygmalion mistake that this is the one measure which is all important, and that is what has happened today, then you fall into a trap and you make mistaken policies, because the GDP doesn't cover many very important aspects of nations' progress. In particular, the GDP doesn't distinguish between needs and wants. If somebody is having luxury goods and children are having bread, the bread is worth only $1, and the Mercedes is worth $100,000. So the GDP measures the consumption of the Mercedes as a very important thing, 100,000 times the bread, even though the bread may be much more important in terms of life sustenance. Because GDP doesn't differentiate between what is necessary for our lives and what is unimportant. There was the discovery of Easterlin Paradox in the 1970s, where it was learned that massive increases have occurred in consumption of goods and services. That is, GDP has increased hugely, but there has been no corresponding increase in happiness, overall happiness of the population. So why is that? Well, this was explored, and it turns out that there is a set point effect. As you get more and more of luxuries, you get accustomed to having those luxuries, and this becomes part of your standard lifestyle. So then you are not, it doesn't make you happy, and you need more and more to become happy, because otherwise you accept it as normal, and then the loss of that lifestyle causes you unhappiness. So that's the set point effect. And then there's of course relativity. You look at what everybody else is doing, and if everybody else is doing better than you, then even if you are already at a very high level, you still feel deprived and unhappy. So as the average standard of living rises, everybody compares themselves to the average, and so there is no gain for the group as a whole. And finally, there is long run happiness versus short run happiness. In the short run, if I'm hungry and I eat food, it makes me happy. But in the long run, happiness does not depend on consumptions of goods and services. It depends on certain character traits and social networks, things which are not part of goods and services. Today, it is possible to provide food for everybody and to take care of the basic needs, health, education, welfare, housing, for everybody on this planet. But the goal has not been to provide basic needs to all, but to maximize the production of goods according to the value in the marketplace. And so this has led to policies which ignore the existence of poverty and hunger and many deprivations which billions of people face. And it has led to a mad race to maximize the amount of wealth, regardless of who has it. And this has been opposed by people who have said that we should change our goals by changing the definition of GDP, changing the definition of progress, changing the definition of prosperity. And the pioneer among these was Mahbubul Haq, who introduced the Human Development Index, and this adds education and health factors, life expectancy into the simple GNP, to expand it to takes into account some aspects of people's lives which GDP does not. Amartya Sen built upon the ideas of Mahbubul Haq to introduce the capabilities approach, and Stiglitz and Fitoussi report recently discusses the many shortcomings of GNP as a measure of our life and its our welfare. Economic theory is all about maximization. It says that rational behavior is about maximization of the pleasure that we get from goods and services, and does not take into account the rich and complex fabric of our lives, and how our happiness doesn't really depend so crucially on goods and services. It depends on a lot of other factors. And there are similarly, the philosophy of logical positivism led to a misunderstanding of science, and based on this misunderstanding, economics was created as a realm of secular knowledge, driving out morality. But in fact, this is a wrong methodology for social sciences, because considerations of what is good and what is bad cannot be kept out of the social sciences. We need to know what is good behavior, what is bad behavior, what is a good society. So economics does not explicitly define these, and because it hides the moral foundations, it is built on very bad moral foundations, and does not allow us to discuss these moral foundations, because it defines itself as being an objective and factual discipline, whereas in fact it is a moral discipline. So the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report has criticized the GDP in three dimensions. One is that if you just take the GDP on its own domain as a measure of market activity, it fails to measure a lot of things, and prices the value of a lot of things in a incorrect way. And so even within its own domain, its GDP is seriously deficient. But if we go beyond the GDP to assess the quality of life that people are living in a given nation, then we have to go outside the traditional, we have to go outside the marketplace, because the GDP is confined purely to what is being sold and what is being bought. But there are many dimensions of our lives which are not in the marketplace, and these must be taken into account. And finally, the third dimension that the GDP ignores is, okay, today we are consuming well, but if we are polluting the oceans and cutting off the forest, what will happen to us tomorrow? So sustainability is another important dimension that is not captured in the traditional GDP measures. So some of the issues with the classical GDP measures is that as we purchase goods, the quality of goods changes, and these quality changes are not reflected in the GDP measures, and this has a lot of impact. And also in services, the correct value of services may not be reflected in the market price. For example, if education is sold in the marketplace, the price of education may not reflect its social value. Similarly, providing health for people may not be, may have value to society far different from the cost of providing medical care. In addition, government services are just valued at how much money is being spent on the government, but the question of what are the services being provided to the population by the government, this is what matters, and this is not measured. In general, this is a problem that the market prices, if somebody sells a good, then this is counted as for $100, then this is counted as a $100 contribution. But the market price does not reflect the social value. For example, there are these goods like tobacco, alcohol, and even sugar, which are sold at a certain price, but both tobacco has actually inflicts a lot of harm to those who has purchased. So when $1 million worth of tobacco is sold, this is counted as an addition of $1 million to GDP, whereas it should actually be considered that there is a lot of harm to health being done by this product, and so this is not the correct value of the addition to the GDP. So basically, the market prices are private prices, and what we need to do is to take into consideration the social costs, which may have to do with not only health effects, but pollution and environment and other factors which are not taken into account by the market price. So when we consider well-being of people, then it goes far beyond the market. We have to look at health, education, and we have to look at how people are living their lives. What do they do? How do they work? What do they play? What do they do for entertainment? And then we have to see whether they are participating in the political activities, whether they feel empowered to change. We have to look at their social connections. We have to look at the environment they're living in, and we have to look at how secure they are in terms both of their income and in terms of war and peace issues, fights and terrorism and all of those things. So all of these things contribute to our lives, but they are nowhere part of the GNP. If we want to look at the social welfare of people, then we have to make the needs and wants distinction. To the extent that people are getting what they need, this is very important for their welfare. But if they are getting engaged in israf and tabzir, excess consumption or conspicuous consumption, this is not actually useful for them, and it is actually harmful to the society as a whole. If somebody builds a huge palace and causes other people to envy it, this is actually a negative externality. So similarly, there are many non-market activities which are not priced in the market, like mothers providing care to their children. This is not sold in the marketplace, but it is a very valuable and important service which is essential for the continuation of society. So similarly, instead of looking at individual consumption, we have to look at what is happening to the households, to the families. We have to look at the income distribution, which is not being considered by the GNP. we have to look at the social networks, relationships, and we have to look at character, because this is an essential part of long-run happiness, that one has the required essential character traits that are needed for long-run happiness. But none of these is part of the GNP. For sustainability, there are the famous 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, of which I mentioned just a few here. Elimination of poverty is essential for us to have good lives, and pursuing GDP does not do much to eliminate poverty. So this has to be directly made a goal of development. Similarly, the issues of war and peace are not considered, but these are essential for our lives. And provision of justice to people in the population is a very important factor in promoting good life, but is not taken into account. And similarly, the biosphere, the animals and the fishes and the environment, this is not taken into account, but it is a very important part of our lives. So all of these things must be considered if we want to characterize the prosperity of a nation, and these are certainly not part of the GNP measure. How can we create all this change? Well, basically, it requires strategy. So Mahbubul Haq was aware that just pursuing GNP creates a lot of inequality, because you just create wealth and wealth and wealth, and all of this wealth goes into the hands of those who are already wealthy. So he wanted to move beyond GDP, but he realized that a far-reaching reform like the ones that we have discussed would not be acceptable. So he said that let's make a small change to GDP. Let's add to the GDP something like education and health, as measured by life expectancy, for example. So if we add just a few things, this will be an acceptable change. So this is a pragmatic strategy, and it worked in the sense that people have accepted the Human Development Index, because basically it makes small changes in the GDP. It says that let's add a few things. Mahbubul Haq was well aware that this does not capture all of the problems with the GDP, but he was using a strategy. He said that this is something that we can sell. If I try to sell the whole package, if a radical reform, it will not fly. So this was a pragmatic strategy. So there were many other things that need to be added, and these are being worked on today. So to conclude this lecture, we understand that what is being measured, the statistics, is not just an objective and neutral thing, but rather it is interests of some people who, it is in the interest of some people to measure some things, and it is also in their interest to ignore other things. So for example, if you want to find accurate figures on poverty, how many people are poor, how many people are hungry, it's very hard to find, even though this is the more important thing from the perspective of prosperity, because it is not in the interest of the small minority, the 1%, to allow people to know how many hungry people they are. They want to portray the world as being a very wonderful place where wealth is increasing, and they want to hide the fact that the wealth is increasing in their pockets. Like in the recent COVID crisis, the billionaires got very rich very quickly. So the numbers that we see are factual, but at the same time they are propaganda, because the numbers that we see are the wealth numbers, but we don't see the poverty numbers, we don't see the hunger numbers, we don't see the debt numbers. So everyone who is pushing numbers has an agenda for pushing these numbers. And so a statistician cannot be blind to these agendas and cannot be blind to the realities of the world which is producing these numbers. And yet this is what conventional statisticians are trained to do. They are trained to just look at the numbers and not look at the hidden agendas. So understanding the numbers requires us to go beyond the numbers to the real world context which is producing these numbers.